This man is the opposite of Elijah. When you meet Elijah, you cower, you tremble. This guy was strong. But Jeremiah is as tender as a woman, and yet as enduring and strong as a man. God seems to choose unlikely instruments for his most important work. Sometime, one pleasant Sabbath afternoon, read through the book of Judges. Everybody God uses in that book and everything God uses in that book is ridiculous. He chooses a harlot's son to be a deliverer. He uses a crazy young madman by the name of Samson to destroy the Philistines. He selects a woman as to be the prophet of Israel. And a man left-handed in another crisis, and I understand that. The book of Judges, everything God uses. Abimelech, the murderer, is killed by a woman who drops a stone from a height, and the great soldier is killed by the woman. Sisera, another great tyrant, is put to sleep by his hostess, and then she hammers out his brains with a hammer and a peg. Read the book of Judges. God uses unusual people and unusual implements. And Jeremiah is one of the most unusual people you could ever imagine to stand up against a nation, against false prophets, against priests, against kings, against the mob. Time and again the mob grab him and say, let's kill him. He lives through the reign of 5 kings. Only one of them is good. The first one, Josiah. And Josiah is killed in the Battle of Megiddo, caused the greatest avalanche of grief Judah had ever known. He was such a good man. But grace doesn't run in the blood, and none of his sons were good. So we get Jehoahaz and we get Jehoiakim, Zedekiah, all his sons, all bad. And the worst of them was semi-religious. This I find very interesting, because the main problem in churches today is the people who are semi-religious. Weakness is the next thing to wickedness, and Zedekiah is a very weak king. But he's got an interest in religion. He'll call for the prophet, call him out of prison, and say, is there any word from the Lord? And then send him back to prison. And Jeremiah counsels him, tells him the word from the Lord. You must not rebel against the king of Babylon. God has selected Babylon to punish Judah. You must not rebel. But he's putty in the hands of his politicians. So he does rebel. And ultimately, when the city is besieged for 30 months and women are eating their own children and people are falling everywhere in the streets from hunger, he escapes, but he's caught by the Babylonians, and his sons are killed in front of him, and having seen that sight, his eyes are taken out. Weakness leads to wickedness, and wickedness leads to disaster and terrible, terrible pain and grief. Let me remind you of the situation of the world in Jeremiah's time. Assyria had been a great empire for centuries. They had taken captive the 10 tribes of Israel. A lot of rubbish has been written about the missing tribes. I had a grandmother who was a good woman, but she'd been taken in by the British Israel theory. My father's mother was very religious, and she believed that the British were the descendants of the 10 lost tribes, and that the King George of the time and later kings and finally Elizabeth were all descendants of the kings and queens of Israel. This is sheer rubbish. Happily, the theory is now almost dead, though Herbert W. Armstrong adopted much of it when he ran the Worldwide Church of God and put out a very interesting magazine. The only thing wrong with it was that it was quite inaccurate, but it was always interesting. And he taught that the Americans, having come from the Britishers, were the result of the 10 lost tribes. Well, all that's now been thrown out. So Assyria, for hundreds of years, rules the world. Nineveh is the great capital, but 612 Nineveh goes down. And now the Egyptian Empire comes along, and God foretells that Egypt will lose its greatness. And when it does, it would never again be great. And this empire, which for centuries was the greatest empire in the world long before Assyria, ultimately becomes what the Bible calls a base kingdom, which is what it is now. But in the time of Jeremiah, Egypt was very, very powerful, and it was in fighting against the invading Egyptians that the one good king Jeremiah knew was killed, Josiah. Egypt is finally defeated at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 by Babylon. And Jeremiah, who spends over 48 chapters predicting the fate of his own people, maybe 45 chapters, gives about 7 chapters to the fate of 9 different nations, and he gives 110 verses to the fate of Babylon. And those prophecies took 500 years to be completely fulfilled. And no one can say they were written after the event. And Babylon still had people living in it when the New Testament was written, but it had lost its greatness. It took 500 years for the foundations of Babylon to be destroyed. So there's the world in which Jeremiah lives. Empires are toppling. Assyria's gone down in his lifetime. Egypt goes down in his lifetime. He foretells that Babylon will go down, but he's most concerned with Judah, God's kingdom on earth. He will see it destroyed, the city burnt, the temple burnt, and he weeps. Like Christ, he loves his people, but his heart is wrung with anguish by their sins.